All right, everybody, we should be live for our next devcast here on the Game Wisdom channel. I'm, of course, Josh Placer, and we have another discussion lined up today. My guest tonight is a developer as well as a researcher into urban planning and city design. He is the author of the book Virtual Cities that takes a look at fictional in-game cities or video game cities and studying their architecture and layout and how they can be used to kind of grow your understanding. So please welcome to the cast Konstantinos.
So, hello everyone, and thanks for having me, Josh.
It is
It's,
great. Oh,
it's lovely to be here.
yeah, it's great to have you on. How are you doing today?
It's been a pretty long day involving kids that wake up at 4 a.m. But otherwise, fine. Can't complain about things.
Well,
What-
it is a pleasure to have you on. Uh, Thank you for reaching out to me on Twitter. For all the developers watching, we are always looking for new guests to come on for our live and recorded talks like these. So my inbox is always open, so feel free to buzz me. But we have a great conversation as we're going to be talking a lot about environmental and level design, and we get a chance, depending on how long this goes, we may get into some city building talks as well. And city building is definitely one of my favorite genres. I'm sure it's one of yours as well, considering your book Virtual Cities.
Absolutely, yeah.
So,
Citizen games are my main interest, I would say, in level design and game. So,
alright. With this being your first time on the cast, for people watching us, could you talk a little bit about who you are and what your background is when it comes to game dev?
well, I'm Konstantinos. I've been writing about games since 2006, like in a semi-professional, mostly hobbyist manner, while finishing my studies and research in actual urbanism. I actually have a PhD in urban planning and city geography, and since roughly 2010, I've been full-time employed in games. Either as initially as a journalist, as a QA, and eventually as a designer, level designer who specialized in cities and urban environments and systems and everything that has to do with cities, which is a pretty wide field if you think about it. I mean, you've got
Mm-hmm.
to have storytelling and narrative to gameplay and other sort of bits that can fit in.
Mm-hmm. And trying and like kind of like looking at like urban planning, city design, and kind of bring that into video games. It's like the whole discussion about environmental design is a very fascinating one, as it's not something that I think a lot of people thought about when it came to the game industry for maybe like 20, 30 years. Like it really wasn't until I would say maybe the last decade, maybe a little bit before that, that we began to really see developers kind of want to explore this space beyond just pure level design. Or I guess when we say level design, we're talking about like pure like obstacles, try and put in like the traps, enemies, things like that.
This is true, and I believe it's mostly down to technical limitations and the fact that after a certain point we've reached the ability to craft really intricate environments and try and make them not only fun to play in but also believable and interesting for all humans, like not those humans that just enjoy playing video games. So there's definitely that, but I would argue that there have been you know really old games that even though they didn't call it that back then, did environmental design very impressively. And I mean, I can think all the way back to um, I'm thinking Infocom's A Mind Forever Voyaging,
Mm-hmm.
which came with a very dynamic, very realistic, very fascinating city that you got to explore, in increments of 10 years, I think, a decade or two. And It was actually made by someone who had at some point studied urban planning, and that's one of the reasons it felt so real. But it was just, it was very symbolic back then. You just used a few symbols and a few clever touches, whereas nowadays you get to go all the way to, simulating an open world or something of the sort.
Hmm. And I'm glad you mentioned about the open world design because that has certainly been a very huge push in terms of environmental design. If you look at stuff like the Assassin's Creed franchise, and even if we talk about like modeling like real cities in games, there's of course Watch Dogs, Marvel Spider-Man, and it's getting or it has gone to that point where I think some of the best games tend to integrate both environmental and level design together. I get another, I guess, like the king right now would be something like a Prey or just Arcane Studios in general with their designs.
True. I mean, the, the open worlds really, that they're both a challenge and an opportunity to make really impressive and say, immersive places. The fact that you have this analog quality of space, the fact that everything is connected to everything else, and these worlds promise you a huge possibility space. They give you this fleeting sense that anything can be done and tried, and every nook and cranny explored, and every room visited, which is an illusion that usually breaks down pretty quickly. But still, it's just the idea of playing in such a thing or crafting it is always fascinating to everyone involved. So it's one of the reasons I think people tend to gravitate towards open worlds these days. Though, admittedly, I don't consider it like a necessity. You can do really, really excellent stuff with, what I like to call curated game spaces. Like what Dishonored did, or what Half-Life 2 did. Just implied the complete environment and focus on certain aspects of it just to make them feel just right and perfect.
Hmm. Now, I know when we spoke on Twitter, kind of like getting things set up for this cast, I of course mentioned like the Souls-like genre, Dark Souls, Demon Souls, games like that. And like to me, like Demon Souls was really one of, like the first like non like city building or like city focused games to really go all in with its environmental design. And I just want to get your thoughts. Like when we look at stuff like the Souls like genre. Like, what do you think about them from an environmental or an urban planning or I guess a medieval planning kind of design?
Well, to be honest, I haven't dared play Demon Souls, but I really love Dark Souls, despite the fact that I'm just not particularly good at it. I mean, it took me much longer than everyone else I know to go anywhere. But I have to admit that this sort of game gives you the opportunity to really add interesting details to your environments, to really work on a granular level. And I believe that this excellent world and environmental building is actually based and supported by the fact that players will have to die quite a bit,
Hmm.
and thus will have to pay attention to everything happening around them. And this is how, at least Dark Souls, with for which I mean I sort of understand more, actually manages to convey its incredible world to you, and it lets you, think about it and really understand how it works and everything. I think it's a very fascinating way to craft environments, and a way that's absolutely unique to video games.
Hmm.
I mean, you couldn't do that in any other medium. You couldn't force this type of attention in, I don't know, in a movie.
Yeah. And I wrote a post recently about Souls like design and that kind of integration between level and environmental design, and how they're one of the few developers I think really hammers on that point that both are important when you're trying to build these places up. Because we see, I guess, here's a bit of a question for you. And actually, before I get to that, to Mojo's question in chat, is your book Virtual City still in print?
Yes, Sure, yeah. As far as I know, it's actually at the printers, and it should be heading to a warehouse in somewhere in England, probably within the month or early October, so that it will start shipping out. I mean, I haven't actually held it in my hands yet, but it's just printing. It's being printed and probably being shipped over.
Nice.
So yeah, that's it. I think we're good on this front.
Okay. So, to back to my
Okay.
question, what I want to ask you about is like from that kind of Souls-like experience where we see environmental and level design combined. I want to get your thoughts on something like Doom slash like Doom Eternal. You had a chance to look at those games that they tend to, I think, be almost like the antithesis. Like they seem to be very level design focused, but it didn't really seem like the environment was really, I guess, being brought into the equation to me.
I wouldn't be so harsh. I mean, it's obviously not such a completely, well
Mm-hmm.
thought out, sensible, 100% sensible environment, etc. But I mean, it's generally excellent when it comes to level design,
Mm-hmm.
and it looks good, and it makes enough sense. I mean, this is you're like in space or in hell, so I mean, the paradigms in your head are not set in stone, and you're willing to suspend your disbelief. And as far as things, well, as far as it goes, when it comes to the cohesiveness of stuff and how sensible they are within the game logic, I mean, they're fine. They work. Yes, obviously they don't have to be based as much in real life stuff and integrate level design with environmental design the way Zelda does, like
Mm-hmm.
Breath or Half-Life 2, or those games that feel more immersive. But yeah, possibly there's no need to do this. I mean, since you've got this super fast-paced game that so it revels in the violence and in the up-close combat. So yeah, it's perfect for what it is.
Okay.
And
Now,
if you're
one.
interested, it looks good. I mean, that's an interesting thing.
Mhm. Now, I think one thing I definitely want to ask you before we kind of get like further into our conversation, like we've been using the terms environmental and level design for the past like 15 minutes or so, and for a lot of people, I think it's easy to conflate the two together. So, in your opinion, where do you feel, I guess, is that dividing point between what is level design and what is environmental design?
Well, the thing is that they both share the fact that they are about shaping games space. So a game space is necessarily both a level and an environment. So I would say that the environment part is generally the one that's more supportive. It's the one that's not as crucial to the core experience as the level design part. So I mean, when I'm working, generally speaking, when it comes to making a choice that is more realistic or more aesthetically pleasing in an environmental from an environmental perspective, but would hurt the gameplay, I would tend to gravitate towards the gameplay. So I would say like the environment thing is it's the setting, it's the scenery, it's what you would see in a theater without any actors on.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the level design is everything that happens combined, including the actors, including what they have to say, where they have to move, and everything. So this is the super important thing, but the rest is also there to really flesh out the experience, and in some cases it might even take center stage. So I don't know if I'm answering this to you, because I mean it's actually with the terms and definitions there are I mean there are many ways of thinking about those elements, but practically that's how I approach them.
All right.
hopefully answered.
Yeah, and it is very difficult sometimes to separate the two, especially when we look at how much the game industry has really grown in the last. We could easily say in the last 20 years with the kind of the full arrival of 3D. And I think that was kind of like where we really began to see this greater discussion. I'm sure everybody here remembers Grand Theft Auto 3 for the first time. And oh my god, you're able to walk around this actual city. It wasn't just, a top down view.
Yep. 3D was very important. And 3D was important mainly because we're used to looking at the world around us in 3D, and being able to partly replicate that, everyday feeling in a video game. It sort of allowed us to imagine completely immersive stuff. GTA 3 was essentially the first mainstream game to really show a lot of people that, look, this is how a virtual environment, a major city could be, for example, experienced in a video game, and that's why it was incredibly important.
Hmm. So, one thing I wanted to ask you about, especially with the research you've done, the games that you've had a chance to work on, that, again, for a lot of people, it's not really a conversation about, why should I make my place look realistic? Why can't I just make, mazes of corridors and stuff like that? And, like, we've seen, again, like, that kind of, almost that evolution of going from, hey, let's just, it's a hospital, but, it's, 47 corridors all leading in various different directions, versus, here's an actual building, explore this. So the question for you is, where do you think, or what do you think can help a developer if they start understanding urban planning, urban design, architecture, and trying to integrate that into their video games?
I would say I would first like to say why they should try to.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why is that, the sciences and practices and arts that have been around for a few thousand years. So we've had the opportunity to refine them. I mean, both in urban planning and design, but also in architecture, we know how to shape space in order for it to be evocative. When we want it to feel safe, when we want it to impress or scare people away, we know that if you create a small, city square that's up to 35, 40 meters wide, people will get this cozy feeling. Why do they get this cozy feeling? Because they can actually recognize the face of everyone coming in. And we also know that how wide a sidewalk should be for it to feel comfortable. And we know that there's the art of the entrance when we enter a major public building or a museum. So we know these things, and we have refined them over countless years. And there's still innovation. There's still interesting things happening, and people know what to expect from buildings and everything else. So taking this sense of spatiality, if you want, and actually transferring it into games makes games feel, you know, more believable and more immersive, not in a realistic sense, but in the sense of the creation of an illusion. Their illusions become better. The suspension of disbelief is better supported. And also, we can make game spaces that are more functional, both in terms of gameplay and in terms of how they feel. Exactly because we know how real buildings work, we can, for example, make certain that lines of sight in a first-person shooter what they should be. And generally speaking, the rules guiding a comfortable house and the rules of interesting combat could easily overlap, and we can satisfy both needs this way. So um, I think that should answer it for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And being able to make these spaces more meaningful is certainly I think another very interesting aspect of as we saw this growth of environmental design with with a lot of these more recent entries. Again, Arcane, the Souls games, and I guess this is one thing that I've always thought about as well. Like as we've said a few minutes ago, with that combination of level design and environmental design, that I'm sure somebody could be thinking right now, if I'm building a super challenging first person shooter or a hardcore hack and slash game, why do I need to worry about whether my castles make sense or why this environment should look like it could be a real place if the player is moving, high speed, double, triple, quadruple jumping around, sliding, and doing all manner of crazy things?
Well, I would argue here that you know I think it was Polidori who first approached the matter of the suspension of disbelief, and he said, if it was him, that we romantics, for example, are discussing stuff like vampires and extreme supernatural beings and amazing horrors and everything. So for us, we're doing this incredibly out there, especially for the 19th century type of literature,
Mm-hmm.
making certain that our readers are able to suspend their disbelief is even more important. So I would argue that the wilder the setting and the weirder it is, the more cohesive and sensible and the more uh, tied to its internal rules it should be. I cannot imagine, a world that feels silly and wrong, and not wrong because you want it to feel wrong because it's, some sort of horror place or love nightmare. It feels wrong because the people who put it together didn't understand how things are put together. Is, often laughable,
Mm-hmm.
and it may just feel wrong. Whereas, an expertly crafted world, and nothing like, City 17, again, as you said, arcane cities and environments, or the Zelda's Breath of the Wild,
Mm-hmm.
amazing open world, possibly the best open world
Mm-hmm.
I've ever run into. And those are places that feel like places. Those are places that make us care for them and care for what's happening inside them. And they actually, even for a few hours, feel real. For me, this is an important. Obviously, if you are, if you're a competitive player who's just interested in, I don't know, beating someone else in an esports league, which is fine, you probably won't pay too much attention to that. And also, speaking of believability and immersion, try to remember that, you know, when you visit Anor Londo in the first and the third Dark Souls, which is this incredibly whimsical, completely odd place, the fact that you have familiar elements inside, you have this Gothic architecture that you recognize. You have the essentially, uh, one expanded Duomo di Milano in the center of the city, and those are all familiar. Those are all grounded in our reality. They somehow make this place even more real, even more concrete, and they ground it to the way we understand the world. And it's better for that. It's weirder, it's scarier, it's more effective. It doesn't feel like a chip cutout and a stupid thing someone just did through a studio.
Mm-hmm. There's a
So yeah.
there's a term that I always like to use when I talk about video games like this. It's kind of like realistic fiction. That yes, this is a fantasy world. We're using fireballs and there's zombies and dragons, but there still needs to be some semblance of grounding. As you said earlier, like being able to suspend the player's disbelief that they are playing a video game. That they can't that they can ignore the unseen hand of the designer and really get immersed by what's happening is it's a high watermark, I think, for a master level game design. And you mentioned, of course, Breath of the Wild several times, and yeah, that That's definitely one of my all-time favorite games. And a lot of that is just, again, about being able to really explore that space. And it's not something you could do if you only focused on the level design. And it really takes a careful eye of the designer or the design team to be able to bring that to life.
Absolutely. And I mean, the more you play and the more you explore its world, the more you realize the amount of thought and
Mm-hmm.
the systemic thought that's gone into it. The fact that it is essentially a world that looks a bit like Disneyland. I mean, you have like this central axis, and then you have very specific and very orderly regions around it, and yet it never feels artificial. And yet I mean, it's easy to navigate. It's always it's got a geography that you can read and understand and remember, but it never feels as if it's something that was constructed for your own pleasure. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
feel fake. It doesn't. Whatever it does subtly. And this is. I don't think anyone else has done it on this scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think like when I think about like open world design, I mean this is definitely a discussion. This could be a cast in of itself. And we've had kind of parts of the discussion in the past, but when I think about kind of making that open world really pop for me, games like Breath of the Wild, I think would be like number one on my list. And part of that, again, is that level of immersion and that interactivity the player has in the space. And as you said earlier, with again, like allowing the player to really explore. It's not a case of I'm going to walk forward. Oh, there's an invisible wall here. Or one of my favorites is when we have like third-person games where there's a fence or there's a box blocking the way, and I can jump higher than that fence, but no, I'm not allowed to explore. Breath of the Wild just says, here's a mountainside, go climb it. You know, as long as you have enough grip meter, you can climb that thing.
Yeah.
And oh, go ahead.
Seriously. I mean, I want to say that this, the fact that the fiction of the world and the mechanics of the world just become one thing, and you do what you feel that makes sense there, that you can do it. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what it was.
And like the opposite of that, I think where a lot of open world kind of games lose me is when the open world just feels like an excuse for space. That here's this just massive environment, but you can only do maybe 5, 6 things in it. And like going back to the Assassin's Creed games, this is one of the things that kind of led to me like falling out of, like the interest in that franchise. That it always felt like there's more stuff to do, but I'm still coming back to the same 3 or 4 gameplay loops. And I love exploring them, like the museum or Discovery Tour features, and Odyssey and Origins. That stuff was amazing for me, but I didn't feel like wanting to play the game in those spaces, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I have actually not played anything past a Syndicate, I believe, but I
Mm-hmm.
did grab the museum version of Origins because it's what interests me. I mean, I do not want to engage in the same repetitive,
Mm-hmm.
uh, gameplay loops, and I always feel that the artistry and research poured into those games is almost wasted.
Mm-hmm.
At least for me. I mean, I'm obviously not the target audience. I do not enjoy this type of game necessarily, but I can see and that those worlds have been pains painfully crafted, and people have poured blood and tears and sweat in that, and it's so well researched and so cleverly abstracted that I don't feel like going around slaughtering people in
Mm-hmm.
those beautiful environments. It just feels wrong. But yeah, sometimes what many games actually lack. It's this thing that adventure games have. Point and click adventure games. You had this wonderful look at verb the fact that you could explore everything on your screen. You could and just get a tiny interaction, a small, very short description, a little in joke, a small world building detail. But the fact that you could look at everything added this huge complexity to the world, and somehow transform the single scrolling screen of a few thousand pixels into a completely breathing, detailed, deep space. And we lack this lookout thing. Very few games do that. Very few games give you the sense of actual exploration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think to build off of that, there's always been, I think, that push and pull when it comes to guiding the player in games like this. There are some games like Ghost Recon, the latest one, I think Wildlands, they introduced the idea of a ghost mode that completely turns off the UI, and you're free to explore at your leisure. But the game really wasn't designed around that. And then there are plenty of games that will just say, okay, go west of this town until you find a rock. Turn right at the rock, come to a decrepit building, and go behind that for your treasure chests. And it's very hard, I think, to kind of figure out just how much you want kind of to be the guide of that player. Because there have been games, there have definitely been a lot, especially on the computer, of like open world, even just open space games, where it's just basically, here's all this stuff, kick you out the door, do whatever you want, we're not even going to tell you what's happening in this game.
Yeah, true. And once again, I would say that Breath of the Wild excels in this type
Mm-hmm.
of thing. I mean, it walks this fine line between guidance and freedom, and actually subtle guidance
Mm-hmm.
and complete freedom, typically, nominally. And it does that very well. And then there are, games that do not actually trust players enough.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that this is a major problem when it comes to contemporary mainstream design. For some reason, mainstream media tends to think that we are all stupid and we need to be guided. And
Mm-hmm.
since we've been taught that we are to be guided, we sort of expect to be guided and then act stupidly when aren't guided. But then you see games like, Dark Souls, and you see games like, I don't know, Dwarf Fortress, and you see
Mm-hmm.
those games that are really demanding from players, and you see that people love them, and you
Mm-hmm.
see that people actually can read and they can, think complex thoughts. And that's when things can get interesting. If we decide to trust people and gamers a bit more, I think we can do really wonderful things. For example, I mean, Disco Elysium. This was a game that, if you presented it to the average, you know, AAA company, they would simply freak out and say that this will fail.
Oh, yeah.
And you see that they trusted people and they got this wonderful thing, and thankfully we got it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been getting back into Factorio that finally hit 1.0 last month. And
Mhm.
yeah, like you said, there are some amazing examples of games that at least almost like kind of emergent behavior of just letting the player get into that space and figure out what's going on. And I like what you said a few minutes ago about Breath of the Wild and how it is very much non-handholdy in its
Oh,
design, but it also provides a player with very specific objectives in that space. Go find these shrines. These shrines will give you more power. Go to these 4 dungeons, they'll help you. But then the game basically says, in order to do all that, go nuts. Do whatever the heck you want. But these are kind of like those major, or these are kind of like our, I think I use the term like anchor points in my book. Like, these are the things you should focus on. But you can do them however, whenever, and whatever you want to accomplish that.
and it also wisely has created. This is back to the discussion of traditional space-related science and level design. For example, Breath of the Wild really knows how to shape space in order for it to be more navigable, how in order for it to be more legible and easy to mentally map. So you've got,
Mm-hmm.
major landmarks. You have very specific paths. You have defining edges which can stop you. You have all the elements that you know we've been teaching young urbanists for years, and we've been telling them to read Lynch's work on the image of the city and good urban form, good city form, and
Mm-hmm.
you can see those things perfectly applied, but especially for games. I mean, they've been slightly changed to fit the medium, but the core ideas are there, and these elements are what allows you to just go out in the world and explore without being frustrated. And it's really very interesting, and it's also interesting how this has been enriched by Nintendo's designers, with all the elements that will make certain that your long treks along those roads and paths will be interesting and pleasing and intriguing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think what you said there about kind of uh, creating the landmarks and getting that mental map. It's something that I've said a lot about Dark Souls as well. That
Mhm.
I can look at the world in Dark Souls and begin crafting. Okay, I'm here. I need to get over there. I use the example of a Blight Town that I can look from the top down and see almost exactly where my path is going to go. And like even with Breath of the Wild, I'm just as you were describing that, I was just remembering that challenge you have to find what was it like 10 or 12 landmarks in order to I think get Link's horse, or I think to get the best ending. And I think like when I first saw it, I was like, how the hell am I going to find these 10 random places in this entire space? And by the very end, I think I only had to look up one, and
Yes.
even then, like it worked. Like you can build that kind of mental map, and I think it's something that I think it's lost on some of the other Souls likes and open world games, where either the space is so wide and massive that there are no defined landmarks, or it's so compact, it's so corridor focused that you can't really build a mental map if you can't see more than like 4 feet in front of the player because you're surrounded by walls.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you don't have walls, you have like 1,000 quest markers
Mm-hmm.
trying to grab your attention. And I mean, if you remember, again, Zelda did not use quest markers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you just went to places. Also interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. So sometimes I feel that though we've definitely progressed in many ways. In some ways, we've regressed. Sometimes, or at least in certain mainstream approaches to game design, we've become worse than we were.
Mm-hmm.
Thankfully, I mean, we have like some large studios that are doing amazing stuff. I mean, I'm thinking like, okay, the third Witcher, despite the truly vast world and the quest markers and the dotted paths on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
it was still a very impressive and amazingly crafted game. And Nintendo keeps on doing weird, unexpected stuff with incredible style. But yeah, there is a lack of care at some points, or I don't know, the fear to try anything clever and demanding.
Mm-hmm.
So
Now, now, one question that I want to ask you, like bringing this back to kind of the design or the planning from the developer's standpoint for this stuff, I wanted to turn to something like Prey or Dishonored, where we're talking about places that obviously don't exist, or even something like City 17. As a developer, or for any developers watching, how do you start thinking about your game space in terms of environmental design when you don't have, a one-to-one or even a close to one-to-one kind of example or model to build off of.
Okay, this is. I mean, I could answer this question, in the take up 40 or 50 minutes, but probably, yeah, not interest anyone too much. But I would say that if you sort of have a grasp of how actual cities evolve
Mm-hmm.
and look like, you can do that. And one way of doing that, and this is one of the ways that 617 was actually approached, is after you decide on a feeling, and the feeling is very uh, post Soviet Union collapse, Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you decide on this feeling, you know that you want very defining alien slash evil slash oppressive presence, and then you go and look at actual cities, you go and look at actual urban configurations, you do field trips, you have thousands of photos from Sofia and Belgrade, and I think what else, Sofia, and I think probably even in Serbia, and have uh, anyway, oh, and Budapest, sorry, and Budapest. And you take photos and you copy stuff from reality and you reassemble it in ways that really make sense in your game world, and you try and see what works in reality. For example, in City 17, you don't have one style of buildings. You have a complete history of buildings shown off in the environments. You have from 19th century buildings to early 20th to modernist stuff to Soviet stuff to post-Soviet stuff to postmodern to alien. You've got everything. You've got a whole story in there. Some of them are taken directly from reality. For example, the station where Half-Life 2 begins is one of Budapest's great stations, train stations,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where you start. Then again, I mean, you could just pick one of the standard and very widely known, at least in urbanism, city structure models. And for example, concentric rings. You have the center in the middle, and around it you have the working class residences, and around that the factories, and around that suburban areas and stuff. And you take that and you modify it and play with it and use some concept art and some ideas and play around. But generally speaking, you do have to look at reality, and you do have to copy stuff from it, mainly because it's very easy to do.
Mm-hmm.
Even also, if you look at Prey, which is incredible in its world building, you can see that this is incredibly structured.
Mm-hmm.
This would make sense. I mean, it's a space station, yes, but it would absolutely make sense to have a space station like that in 200 years and just have it function perfectly. So this is the way to approach it. I would say you let reality guide your imagination. You try to analyze how and why reality works, and how we approach it, and what are its rules, and then take those rules and apply them to some sort of incredibly exotic situation, and come up with something weird and fantastic, but also believable up to a point at least.
Yeah. And I like what you said there about Prey, the space age. I think it was Talos 1, Talos 4, I forget the exact name of it. And, like, with that whole setting, again, like, Arcane is definitely one of the masters at, like, just this kind of merging of environmental and level design. That, yes, it's a space age in its far future, sci fi, technobabble, all that other crazy stuff. But at the end of the day, it's still a place where there's a living quarters. There's not a lot of military stuff because it's not a military station. We're not expecting to find 10,000 guns and giant robot mechs fighting things here. And
Exactly.
I think what makes it work is that, on one hand, it's not it's not like the same kind of design something like Doom. Like, there's no jump pads, there's no wall jumps you have to make. But when you combine this kind of very believable space with the tools that they gave you, again, the gloop gun, it's just like for like an emergent gameplay kind of design, it's just amazing about setting that thing up. It lets the player start to make those connections about how do I move around? What can I do in this believable space?
It's what you said right now. It got me thinking that at some point, the way you approach a game and the verbs you give to players actually shape their expectations.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have jump pads and weird guns and outrageous stuff you can do, they do not expect to enter a world where things make sense in the traditional way. They expect a certain level of silliness, and this certain level of silliness supports a different kind of suspension of disbelief. So in Monkey Island, or I don't know, in Psychonauts, or in this type of games where things are really surreal and really weird, we do like the fact that they get silly, and we do expect
Mm-hmm.
our levels and areas and spaces to be slightly silly. That's fine, and we usually do not expect to be thinking about those worlds. I mean, you won't be thinking about the station in Mars of Doom like while driving, and you won't be pondering about it, and you won't be imagining it as a proper place. It's just a nice scenery, and that's it. Whereas when it comes to Prey, you will be thinking about the place, and when it comes to Breath of the Wild and City 17, those are places that stick with you. They are so artful in their creation and so believable, and thus so capable of evoking emotion that they will stick with you. People
Mm-hmm.
remember London, and people remember City 17
Mm-hmm.
because they think about those places. They really, I cannot remember what the name is of of any Doom base, not even the ones from the original Doom, which were like absolutely jaw dropping back then.
Yeah. And I think that's a very interesting point about how memorable this stuff is, because it's not something, no pun intended, that we really think about when we talk about video games in this capacity. We can talk about the story, memorable moments in something like The Last of Us, or kind of understanding the lore of Dark Souls. But to talk about the actual environment or the actual game space and say that that sticks out in your mind, I think that's still a very relatively young conversation when we talk about video games.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, most of the really memorable places are relatively recent. They are of the
Mm-hmm.
past few years,
Yeah,
and they are well. Then again, I think how old is Half Life Two?
I
It's
think
been around, has it?
2004 maybe.
Four?
Let's see. Yep, 2004.
Well, time does fly.
Yes.
Because I mean, because in the past 15 to 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
that's when most memorable spaces. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with the ZX Spectrum.
No.
It was popular in Europe. It was a British micro, an 8-bit one, and fantastic games, mostly very very elegant, arcade type offerings. But I mean, people then rarely cared about actual world building. They rarely cared about you being able to remember anything. It was just have fun with that.
Mm-hmm.
And this ethos sort of guided game design for many years. I mean, up until the mid 90s, I would say that most games were about have some mindless or cute or slightly funny fun, with the exception of adventures and RPGs.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't care for the construction of space that mattered. Whereas nowadays we do have people who excel in that. I mean, we do have Antonov, and we do have studios like Arcane, and even the fact that Ubisoft has become so proficient
Mm-hmm.
in abstracting huge spaces. I mean, managing to cram Victorian London in a game in a way that doesn't feel tiny is a huge accomplishment if you think about it. It's very clever, and I think people care about those things. People love visiting virtual places. People really want to see those. They want to experience those absolutely impossible, spaces, things that they would never be able to do in real life. And nowadays, the visual fidelity of things is convincing enough to help immerse them
Mm-hmm.
in this sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's an interesting experience.
Mm-hmm. And as you were talking about kind of the player caring about the environment, it made me think of something like a Sunset Overdrive. If you had a chance to play that game, or eh, it, the Sunset Overdrive was the game from it was Insomniac. It was a game they did before they did a Marvel Spider-Man. And I think in a lot of ways it was the game that it probably earned them like the IP just because of how crazy it
Right.
was. And the reason why I brought it up was from a mechanics standpoint, I loved exploring that space. It's very kinetic, very much, like you're a kid in a candy store in terms of all the different tech and ways you move around. I think it's one of the few open world games that I just did not ever want to use fast travel because it was such a fun time moving around. But conversely, I cannot remember one thing about that environment. Like, there's nothing about that city that sticks out to me. And it just turned into just a giant semblance of lines grinding and platforms for me to jump on.
Mm.
And again, we keep going back to like Breath of the Wild and Prey in this podcast, but
Mm.
I think there's a reason for that. That yes, you have very interesting ways of moving around in both those games. Breath of the Wild, we haven't even mentioned the hang glide or your power glide. That was just that sense of freedom of doing that. And despite it compared to Sunset Overdrive in terms of how limited you are in your general movement, it felt like it felt like the environment fit those mechanics. I think better, in my opinion.
Mm. Mm. I'm trying to think. I mean, why a game wouldn't be as memorable?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we agree that we generally consider memorability to be something of value,
Mm-hmm.
which we do. Which I mean, I think that the easiest way to approach that would be to accept the fact that even the most crass game is a form of art, or at
Mm-hmm.
least comes close to art, and there is this fine invisible line that sometimes separates great art from just something that's good. And this line might be everything from inspiration to sheer mastery of medium. It could, in our cases in games, it could be some sort of technical amazing breakthrough. But I would say that it's really difficult to define it, just as it's difficult to decide to define. I mean, why is Paris more interesting than, I don't know, Newark? Why is that? I mean, yes, it's definitely the history, but why are it's like major? Oh, sorry, that's weird. That's an old defunct phone. Let's try to remind me of something. I mean, it's not easy. It's not easy to say why is the Eiffel Tower and the Statue of Liberty both relatively modern constructions, like so iconic. Why have they turned into the landmarks they are? It's not a simple question to answer. Why is the Empire State Building more well known than the Chrysler Building? Sometimes it's it's just very difficult to define. I mean, you can, when you see it, you know that it's amazing, you know that it's memorable and very impressive and very clever and touching in many ways. But actually coming up with guidelines and rules to
Hmm.
achieve something, let's say, sublime, not as easy.
Yeah.
I mean, we can analyze Banner Londo and we can see why it's wonderful, or City 17, but telling someone how to replicate that exactly, it's more or less impossible.
Hmm. One thing I remember when I was growing up, like in terms of making things memorable, was I always loved games like this. Again, back during the NES era, that had a world map to them. That it really wasn't just again like a collection of levels. Like stage 1-1, stage 1-2. And I remember like the first time I played Super Mario World, and that, or even I think Super Mario World. Like all of a sudden, I see this like massive space with all these little points to go to, and again, the world map means nothing when it came to level design. Each level was this self-contained obstacle course, but just this idea that I'm actually moving around this world, no matter how abstract it may be, I think really, I think mattered for me. And to Shark's question about Mario 3, I did play Mario 3, but I think it was World where I just really began to. I think the fact that it was just one map, as opposed to Super Mario Bros., where each world was kind of its own, self-contained screen kind of thing.
Yeah, it maps add a sense of cohesiveness to
Hmm.
things. They they help us realize that those are not exactly what you said. Like they're not separate, discrete obstacle courses. They are part of a world.
Hmm.
And also, I think that we generally enjoy looking at maps as species. They give us this sense of power over space. They somehow encapsulate, you know, everything into a piece of paper. They take, the complexity of the world around us and we've always enjoyed maps. So there's no reason not to enjoy, video game maps. And just as you say about Super Mario World, I mean, one of my favorite games ever is the original Gabriel Knight.
Hmm.
And it's amazing when you think about what a tiny game it is. I mean, it's like, I don't know, 60 or 70 backgrounds. That's it. And yet those backgrounds feel huge. They feel like it's a complete New Orleans and a bit of Germany and a bit of Africa, and it's all tied together essentially by two or three maps, two maps of New Orleans and a global map, and that's it. But those maps are just enough to help us, conjure a sense of continuous analog space into our minds. So it's
Hmm.
maps are a good idea. I
Yeah.
mean, even in the Breath of the Wild, the map was wonderful.
Yeah.
People enjoyed looking at the map. I still enjoy looking at the map.
Oh yes. Yeah, I think I was the same way. Like back in the day, like again, like I always I remember like drawing like maps or world maps for games I wanted to make back then.
Exactly.
It's just again like it allows you to, I think, establish that sense of place that it
Hmm.
goes beyond just okay, here's the war level, here's a lava level, and we're done with it. Like this is a world. This is the aquatic temple from Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, and here's a Goron's mountain, and so on.
Exactly. Exactly. And also, I mean, the Zelda games. I mean, the previous one, like Ocarina of Time or even Majora's Mask, they have memorable places.
Hmm.
And they're also memorable partly due to the mechanics and the puzzles those dungeons offer. Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, we cannot overlook that. But they were interesting places. I mean, the water temple. You think about it, and it's a wonderful, fantastic idea.
Yeah. I mean, even a Link to the Past as well. Just a very straightforward map. You have Castle in the Mill, and again, you have the major points surrounding it, but it definitely elevates, I think, these games that have that sense of place. So you can look at a map or look at the environment and go, I know where I'm at, I know where I need to go.
Hmm. Exactly.
So,
Absolutely, I would say.
so
Maps are fascinating. Sorry, yeah, sorry.
no, that's all right. Go ahead.
Let's just have that. I mean, and I do enjoy, even the old cloth maps or the old printed maps that used to came in game boxes that used to come in game boxes. Those are fascinating additions to a game, especially because you knew that an in-game map would actually and essentially look exactly like the one you were holding. I mean, if you were in the world of Ultima, it would be a cloth map,
Yeah.
and you were holding a cloth map, and this had all the qualities we just described for the map, and it really immersed you into a game. And
Hmm.
it's this is another thing we've lost. We've lost the meta part of the game. We've lost the manual and the box. The fact that the experience with the game starts from the moment you actually hold this physical artifact in your hands and open it and play it, and it's sort of added value
Yeah.
to it.
And that's definitely another podcast right there too, in terms of the physicality of some of these games. And I think I have a few like cloth maps of some of the games I bought somewhere around here too.
Yeah, you should keep them. I mean, for Christ's sake, keep them. They are wonderful,
Hmm.
really wonderful, and highly collectible.
Yeah.
I can assume.
So here's a question. I'm not sure if this is something that you've thought about, especially since with looking at urban planning, this will I think be the opposite of that. But in my book that I just finished writing about roguelike design, I talk
Mhm.
specifically about procedural generation and this idea of being able to build a world or build a city, a building, whatever, using that. And what I want to ask you is, have you given any thoughts or have you done any talks or whatever about trying to make that sense of environmental design but in a procedurally generated space? Because again, this is where I think we kind of get at almost like the opposite of this kind of discussion, where again, like a game like Breath of the Wild, Dark Souls, they are 100% handmade. There is no proc gen or random generation in how these worlds are set up. But when we talk about procedurally generated space, you don't have that luxury again of knowing exactly where everything is going to be.
True. This is absolutely true. But I've actually, interestingly, both of the major projects I'm working on right now, and one of them is a pen and paper thing, and the other one is a traditional video game. Both have a lot to do with procedural generation. And what I think about it, and I honestly have to read your book at some point because I really want to know more about roguelikes. Their design, I find it fascinating. But no, when it comes to procedural generation of cities, the thing is that first of all, we have to realize what are the rules and the forces that guide the generation of the city in reality, and try to replicate that and try to understand how cities are built in order to help. For example, if I make a script creating a medieval city, and I just start throwing random blocks that look vaguely medieval, I'm not going to get an interesting result. If I realize that there are three choices, I can have a center around the cathedral, a center around the major guilds hall or the town hall, or I can have two competing centers, and I have those three choices, and my procedure generation starts from a correct choice between the three. This is the way to get to a better result. And this is one thing. The other thing is that both in real life and in games, we enjoy running into surprises. We enjoy the unexpected. We enjoy the sense of vastness and incredible possibilities, but we also enjoy and appreciate the sense of the designer. We occasionally want to feel that, look, I'm walking on the square and someone has designed the square in the Vatican in front of St. Peter's for me to walk and be inspired and awestruck, I don't know, by the power of hope, whatever. But we love to have this sense that there's a genius, a human genius that has shaped the space we're in. And this is why I do believe that we have to have handcrafted stuff into our procedural
Mm-hmm.
creations. I mean, Diablo did that like 20 years ago.
Yep.
You had certain blocks that were always unchanged, and those allowed players to feel the hand of the designer in an otherwise completely procedural thing, but with interesting rules. And, one of the few procedural games I've played lately, well, lately is the past 10 years or so. It's like, I mean, Sunless Sea. When you play Sunless Sea, there's a lot of procedural
Mm-hmm.
content, but it's really structured in a way that feels, designed
Yep.
properly for you. And also in the Binding of Isaac, for example, it's also generally very well done. And then you have, the super scientific way of Dwarf Fortress, which is it's beyond anything I could imagine attempting at any point.
Yeah, and like there are some just insane like open style open world roguelikes out there. I know I recently tried a Caves of Quid, which the
Oh,
game just like procedurally generates the world right at the beginning and then just says, "Here you go run around and die in it for the next 20 minutes."
yes. I mean, I absolutely love the game, the idea of the game. I love the developer. I love the world, but it's just it's a bit too demanding for me at the moment. But I really hope to get into it properly at some point. But it's very impressive, very impressive.
Mhm.
And I do think that you know procedural generation, when used correctly and when used in certain careful ways, it can be applied to all sorts of genres, and it can, even if it's for to shape views. That's it. That could be something that we can handle procedurally.
Mhm.
We don't have to restrict it to games that build their gameplay around the procedural generation of space, like a roguelike. We can also have procedural spaces created and then tinker them. Add the designer's touch afterwards, and having saved a lot of time. So, I mean, procedural generation is definitely something that will keep on rising in importance. When's your book coming out?
I just sent to the publisher. We're hoping to get it out by the end of the year. So fingers crossed on everything there. Yeah, I just finished the final draft 3 times
Oh
last
dear.
week.
Oh dear. Well, your publisher is definitely faster than mine. I mean, we've finished that. It's 14 months ago, like the
Mm,
final edits.
yeah. um, Not as many images, I'm sure, in a book about urban planning and city design, though.
Yeah, there are that makes things way more complicated.
Mm.
Admittedly, the designer has done amazing things. I mean, you give someone this assortment of illustrations and maps of varying sizes and texts of varying sizes and box outs and everything, and tell them just turn that into a book, and they somehow do it, and it's really impressive.
As a quick time check, we are just about an hour and 10 in. So I don't know. Do you still feel good with talking? Do you have again, like a, do you have to go anywhere? I just want to make sure I don't keep you for the next 2, 3 hours.
I don't think I'll be able to stay for the next 2 or 3 hours, but we can definitely chat a bit more, especially if you have something to ask or someone else has anything to ask. At some
Okay.
point, I will have to sleep because I think I'm closing in at the 18-hour, 19-hour mark straight. Yeah.
All right. All right, for Chad, if you do have any questions regarding environmental design about his book, definitely let us know in the comments. But I don't know. Again, at the start, I said that if we depend upon the time, we could go into a discussion about city building. I don't know if you feel like doing that tonight. Again, I am more than happy to have you back on for another discussion in the future.
Sure, probably that would be wiser. I would
Okay.
think. So I'll start malfunctioning at some point.
All right.
Uh, that's an absolute like given.
So I
No, I
think.
mean,
Oh, go ahead.
It's
Okay. So I definitely want to at least go a little bit more into your book for the people watching us live or recorded. So, for them, what is Virtual Cities about?
Well, it's an atlas. It's an atlas of places that I consider beautiful and interesting. Interesting both as places and design wise. And it's been created in order to evoke the feeling of the old atlas. I mean, if you think about the original atlases, at least when they became popular in the 19th century, they mostly described those faraway places with abstract illustrations and not 100% correct geographies and stuff, exactly due to the surveying technology of the time and the tendency of people to overreact. So what I did was pick 45 cities from games, uh, describe them from an in-world perspective, and I mean it's everyone. I was keeping in mind that look, someone from this world is actually describing this for some reason to other people, so that sort of gave it a more narrative, uh, feeling. And every city then is accompanied by a shorter bit on its, which is like in proper format, which is like some design comments and solutions and how certain problems were solved or what it did wonderfully or innovatively. And then I came up with a map of how that place would look in its reality, like what would a map of that place in its reality look like,
Mm-hmm.
and have illustrations instead of screenshots, just to sort of keep things less defined, more leave more space for the imagination. So we have like, I don't know, 100 plus illustrations and 46 maps and everything. And it's something that's meant both as an entertaining read for people who just love cities or love imaginary cities or love video game cities, etc., but also some that will be hopefully helpful for you know environmental artists and designers and game designers and level designers and world builders of sorts. But it's a definitely slightly weird hybrid of a book, but I believe it's. I mean, you'll understand what I'm saying now. It's like when I read it again, I don't hate it, and that's like as good as a book gets. Okay, so that's it. I sort of like it. I still like it after all those years. That's something, and it should be coming out this November. I think there are some pre-orders up on Amazon because the Unbound pre-orders have stopped, but it's coming out this November, at least in Europe and the US and North America at least.
Right now, for my book, I'm trying to pretend it doesn't exist phase, because if I read it again, I'm gonna make like 5 more edits and send it to the publisher.
That's no need to do that, I would say. But yeah, books are fun. They're weird.
So with Urban Cities, you mentioned, of course, City 17. I think you may have said Arkham as well, Arkham City. Are there any other like notable fictional cities or game cities that are featured in the book?
So I think I have an Orlando.
Nice.
Uh, I have Rockville from A Mind Forever Voyaging. Certain cities you will never have heard of, but were famous in the late 80s and 90s in Europe, like the city of Dandara, which was this third-person 3D open world city on an 8-bit, and it was a fantasy weird thing. And I have indeed Arkham City, and you have the Syndicate, London Syndicate, Syndicates London, Assassin's Creed Syndicates London. Uh, wait, well, oh dear, I cannot even remember the contents of my book. Wait, no, we have the Hong Kong from Shadowrun. We have from Shenmue 2. There's Union City from Beneath the Still Sky, and there's from Monkey Island 2. Oh, come on Booty Island. I can't remember the name of the city right now, but it's there. The Citadel from Mass Effect. Shit, at least I remember some. That's something. That's nice. And also Fallen London. Yeah, sure, that one too. But
Yeah.
it's like 45. There's no GTA in it.
Okay.
And
And I guess like with like coming up with like the design or coming up with like laying the stuff out, like for some of these games, like there is no in-game map. Something like Annalundo, for instance.
yeah.
So what was kind of the process for building like a map for something where you don't really have like the full view of it?
Well, I think it was always a balance between keeping, the game geometries that you can see. For example, and you can measure. You can essentially measure. And in Anno London, you had like this central axis that led all the way to the cathedral, and a bit beyond that, everything in its immediate vicinity. And then you sort of flesh that out by reading interviews, trying to zoom out the camera as much as possible, and then just looking at, you know, medieval cities and medieval fort cities that sort of look a bit like it and fill in the blanks. And I mean, or for example, in City 17, you just have a few views and some very rough maps. You see 4 or 5 blocks, but then you have like all the descriptions of this is a Central European city from such and such era, so you can easily come up with a geography of what this place in its entirety would look like.
Mm-hmm.
Or I don't know, in oh, we also have a Stalker Call of Pripyat. So here you had like the actual maps of Pripyat, and you knew you moved them around, and you add in extra detail,
Mm-hmm.
because reality is generally more detailed than an in-game map, especially when it's in 3D. Obviously, I mean, depending on each game, we sort of change that slightly. But the general idea was try to reconstruct this geography and imagine what it would look like in its reality at least.
Mm-hmm. Definitely sounds like again, like it sounds like something that's going to be very fascinating for people wanting to learn more about this topic that, as we've talked about over the last hour or so, it's still something that I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand its impact. And it's one of like the beauties of when we do these discussions on design here on the channel, and when I have other podcast guests on, that it's stuff that I think the general consumer doesn't really think about, but it still affects, I think, their overall opinion and appreciation of the game when it does it right.
I fully agree with you here. Absolutely. It's if you ask someone what they would like. I mean, if you had a mass survey, few would mention something like that, but many would, uh, actually appreciate it. And this is something I often tell my students when it comes to level design, that when you play test, you just want to look at the problem. You want to see what irks people and what bothers them. You don't want to ask them what they want. You don't want to ask them for solutions. Same thing, with the gaming public, let's say. Sometimes they don't know what they want.
Mm-hmm.
They think people think that they want, I don't know, survival horror, and they want their shooters to be like that, and then you have, I don't know, this the new Doom from 2016, and suddenly the shooter formula is turned on its head, and it's become a melee shooter. No one knew they wanted that, but apparently they did. So it's, I mean, yeah, you summed it up
Mm-hmm.
perfectly. Sure.
Yeah, like speaking about like that, like very example, I was watching the GDC talk about Doom 2016, and they were talking about the argument over removing reload as one of the elements of it, and it was just fascinating to hear them have that discussion. That you think like reloading a gun is like so instrumental to first person, third person shooters that removing it would be like a design sin, and they stuck with that, and they gave people something that I think just like blew expectations out of the water with Doom 2016.
Exactly, exactly, absolutely. I mean, impressively, when I got to play it. I mean, I didn't finish it, but I played most of it. I mean, it's a rarity these days. And I absolutely, honestly love it. I haven't enjoyed a first-person shooter in.
I think with that, other than switching over to city building for another hour or two, I am just about out of questions. So, for chat, if you do have any questions regarding environmental design, level design, anything along those lines, please get them in because I think this will be kind of official last call for questions.
Yep.
Because we'll probably wrap things up in maybe like the next, I would say 5 to 10 minutes at this rate. I guess, I guess for you, are there any other aspects about environmental design, level design, city planning that we haven't touched on yet?
Ooh. I mean, we could talk about details. We could talk about the differences between 2D and 3D, or curated and open world, and this sort of thing. But I would say that the only thing we haven't said that might be worth saying is that sometimes, even with very, very limited assets and teams, and even with limited technology, amazing things can be achieved and have been achieved. This is, I don't know, it's not to tell people that, look, you can go ahead and do masterpieces using only chewing gum and, I don't know, three stick figures. Obviously not. But truth be said, when there are limitations, and when you know those limitations, and those limitations could be anything. It could be the fact that you don't have a good programmer in your team, or that we have like five people to create assets, and we want to create, I don't know, a huge metropolis in 3D, whatever. When you have these limitations, you really get to think, and you really get to see what's important, and try to focus on only what's important, and build around that, and find solutions where there seemingly aren't any. And this is when sometimes really excellent things can be created.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that if you want to create something that seems very difficult, just try and think about it, and distill its most important and defining features, and, and I don't know, go for it. That this is like this very vaguely suggestive idea, whatever. But yeah, just sometimes things can be done wonderfully even without huge teams, and even without fantastic batches and supercomputers.
Speaking about like 2D design for a second, I think that actually brings up a question that I think would be very interesting. Because, like we said, like 3D was kind of when this discussion about environmental design took root. But, and part of that reason, again, is that three dimensional space is what we live in. It allows us to process things in that area. I guess, can you give any examples of games that did environmental design right in 2D? You mentioned, of course, a few adventure games earlier, but any other examples about making that work when we're dealing with another dimension like that?
I'm thinking, essentially, adventures in RPGs. They have to be adventures in RPGs mostly, because they're the types of games that are interested. They're simply interested in creating worlds. But there are lots of them, and I'm thinking that, I mean, the Broken Sword games, yes, they're adventure games too, but they did really create very interesting, cohesive places. And then you have, the newer Thimbleweed Park, which essentially created a 2D interconnected open world where 3D was simply painted on in the backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. And and then in RPGs, even, I mean, essentially Baldur's Gate and Planescape Torment are 2D games essentially, as is the original Fallout. So yeah, you can do stuff. You can do amazing stuff in 2D. Dude, you can even do amazing stuff just with text. I mean, as long as you know what to do with it. I mean, I've read, and I think it was in Doctor Sleep by Stephen King. It's the beginning of the book where the Jack's kid enters the city, this town, and you've got like this incredibly pithy description. It's like a four-line description of a city, and it's just there. It's complete. You don't need to add anything, and you simply cannot take anything away. It's just a perfect summation of this particular town. So if you know what you're doing, you can do it in all sorts of mediums, and especially if you understand what the power of your medium and your tools are, what their strong points are, then you can do it brilliantly. So I'm not certain whether I'm answering exactly. Yeah. But I mean, yeah, good examples of 2D spaces would have to be adventure games mostly.
Mm.
And I think there's a question. It's like, well, what are good ways to fill out a
Yeah.
map with things to make it feel lived in without needing a lot of assets? Well, I would say that one of the things to do would be, make certain that you restrict views. For example, I mean, you can have a road that goes on forever in a straight line, and that demands a lot of access, and it's easy. It's very difficult to make that feel, big enough. Whereas if you curve it, for example, and you restrict visibility, you instantly save on assets, and then depending on the overall fidelity of your project. I mean, if you're doing your city with flat shaded blocks, as would be, in a very stylized 3D game, you can easily create a million different buildings just by changing, attributes like height and size and color. I mean, even in code, you could do that, or you could block out areas. I mean, you can restrict access. Something that, for example, Half-Life 2 did a lot. You cannot go this way, but you can hear or see that something is going on
Mm-hmm.
beyond this block, and also hearing stuff is very effective. And okay, if there's a wall here, I can go beyond that, but I can hear, the sirens in the background. So this space is implied, and then you can make certain that things are shown from afar, with very, very simple assets. For example, in Dishonored, you don't have the whole city model, but you do get to travel across the river and peek at the, buildings in the distance, which are like very low res and low poly stuff, which is much cheaper and faster to make. And then you can use modular design, and if you do things cleverly, you can really make certain that people do not notice that. Uh, one of the examples I like to use in the ways to imply size and scale is like, I know that there's this horror movie called it's by Carpenter, I believe, which is called In the Mouth of Madness,
Mm-hmm.
and it supposedly takes place in this midwestern town, and the whole town. I mean, all the sets that show off the town, they comprise of seven buildings, but there are seven buildings laid out in a very specific, iconic of a main street organization of the area. And just because you know that those seven buildings arranged in this particular way mean town city, for example, your brain just fills in the rest. And with seven buildings, you actually create this place. So yeah, those are a few ideas. Fitting it.
Yeah, and like being able to give the player like enough to kind of fill in the blanks themselves. I think that's a really good point. The description from Doctor Sleep. I was trying to think of a few myself. Like when you brought up John Carpenter, I was always thinking. I thought the Prince of Darkness that took place in a single apartment building,
Absolutely, yeah.
or even something like The Thing, where the iconic Arctic base that took up the majority of that movie. Like you don't need to show every single nut and bolt in the wall, but you need to make each room, make each area be like iconic, but still fit within that space. And
Exactly.
again, like we're describing it, it's a lot easier said than done, as we're talking about right here. There's one thing I think very quickly that we didn't touch on that it's something that I've always liked games when they do it right, and
Hmm.
that's the sense of when they get scale right. Where if I'm like some of my favorite games are those that have you being like a shrunken character or being small, and you're exploring it's a living room, but because you're only like 5 inches tall, it's like this massive world, like the Army Men games, a Toy Commander from back in the day, or even something like a Shadow of the Colossus, where it's not you're fighting an enemy who's the same size as you. It's like you're down here, the Colossus is like 60 feet up. Go and climb him. And I always loved it when games like really get that feeling of this a massive scale of this world done right.
Yeah, I mean, all I can say is me too. I mean, it's uh, getting scale, especially scale we're not used to, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a beautiful thing. I mean, it's. I think it's one of the reasons for example, we enjoy, you know, or model trains and this sort
Mm-hmm.
of stuff, or even playing with meters. It's like the difference of scale in itself intrigues us. I mean, it's nice to see this tiny little human and hold this tiny little miniature in your hand, and
Mm-hmm.
it's also impressive and inspiring to see this huge beast wandering. I don't know. But
Mm-hmm.
again, I mean, you mentioned Shadow of the Colossus. It really is a sublime game, and I feel from what little I've seen from the remaster, I think it's lost something in the translation.
Mm-hmm.
It's the addition of detail, but it's like on a surface level, on a very
Mm-hmm.
shallow level. It just removed some of the mistake, and it I mean it kept the blanks that the old game had without allowing you to fill them in anymore.
Yeah.
It sort of did that.
It kind of reminds me of the complaint everyone had about the remake of, or I'm sorry, the remaster of Silent Hill, and they removed that sense of they removed the
Ah,
fog, which
absolutely, that was. And I mean, I actually replayed. Sorry, Silent Hill is another of the citizen in the
okay.
game, because in the book, because I actually replayed it recently, and it hasn't aged a day. It's perfect as it is. And going in there and fiddling with draw distances, it's unbelievably criminal. People shouldn't do these things.
And again, going back to the idea of having an in-game map, I mean that is a literal map of Silent Hill for you to read. And I love when you mark it when the map gets marked and updated based on where you go.
It was this map was also a storytelling tool.
Hmm.
It was a this one, and the maps in the original Thief games were also great.
Yes.
They were like diegetic. They were in world, and they were interesting as plot tools too. So they were fantastic.
Hmm. I'm trying to
What
think
was
anything.
doing?
Yep. And you mentioned a few minutes ago. You mentioned, of course, train sets and model trains, and that just takes me right back to a conversation I had with Chris Beatrice when we talked about the allure of city building design, which again, it's that feeling of you can see all those moving parts work, and I think ultimately, I think this will be like my final thought for this topic. We'll be here for like another hour or so. That when this all comes together, excuse me, on voice is dying. That's good, but when it all comes together, it really is about being able to see this collective whole. That's not, as we said earlier, it's not just about here's stage one, here's stage two. It's about being able to have this entire landscape to explore. And when you can build mechanics that really capitalize on that, whether it's being able to climb anything in Breath of the Wild, being able to jump a jetpack, loop gun your way through Prey, teleport and Dishonor, it really does elevate these titles. It really as we said, it lets the player go into the world itself. And when games do that, it just really creates a new experience.
Yes, it really does. I mean, and I think it's worth pursuing that. It's especially if we want. I don't know if we want to move beyond just making stuff, releasing stuff. Okay, it's good. We all want to survive and live, via games, but there has to be something more. There has to be something that we will be proud to have, left behind. We will be happy to have worked on. It has to be art, at least up to the point that's allowed to us as freelancers or contractors or workers or whatever. But the aspiration to create something beautiful and memorable and worthwhile has to be there. We not just the throwaway stuff, not just cheapen everything up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's and I think players feel that.
Mm-hmm.
They get that.
Yep. And like we said earlier, it may not be something that immediately registers for the consumer, but you can definitely tell when that sense of care and attention to detail is there with a title. Like going back to your book, this is why people remember stuff like say 17, Anor Londo, Arkham City, places that, again, like, even if you're moving at high speed or you're just shooting your way through, you can tell that there's more to this world than just each individual room.
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm. And I think that
love, yeah,
definitely. And I think that is definitely a good point to end our discussion on, at least for today. It has definitely been a pleasure hanging out with you. And like I said, when you are free in the future, I definitely want to have that city building discussion with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I will be glad to. And hopefully I won't have someone, weighing less than 10 kilos wake me up. The dark of night. It's like it's brutal.
Yes. So, with that said, are there any social media places that you post on, place people can follow you that you'd like to mention?
Well, I have my Twitter account, which is at Gnomeslayer, for reasons. That's what it is. And then there's my site, which is it's a game-cities.com. Suppose that's more or less it. I don't have the other stuff, I don't know.
All right, and as you said, your book Virtual Cities will be out by the end of the year.
Yes, yes, it's scheduled for November, and as far as I know, we are on schedule. So this is a good thing. Uh, I'm really looking forward to finally, seeing it printed.
Mm-hmm.
But it's yeah, and then there's another book coming, but
I'm the
I don't.
same way. I have a fourth book
Yeah.
I need to start writing at some
Oh
point.
boy. Yeah, yeah. It's. I
uh,
mean, yeah, yeah. Writing books is very fulfilling in a way.
mm.
Not as good at helping you survive in other ways, but it's definitely worth doing. As apparently you must have noticed.
Yeah. All right. So, with that said, for those of you watching this live or record, we're going to wrap things up. Konstantinos, thank you so much for coming on. It's been, again, a pleasure talking with you, and best of luck with the book release. I hope to pick it up. I hope you can check out my book when it comes out, hopefully at some point as well in the future.
Okay, thank you so much, Josh. I mean, honestly, the pleasure has been all mine. Seriously, thanks a
Thank,
lot.
thank you. So, for those of you watching, we're going to end things for today. If you are new, be sure to check out the Discord and Patreon link down below. I'll include links to Konstantinos' Twitter as well as to Virtual Cities in the recorded version. And we'll be back later tonight for our regular game streams. If you are a developer watching this is either working on an upcoming game or just wants to talk game design with me, we are always looking for new guests. Be sure to get in touch. You'll find me, on Twitter. There's links in the YouTube here, and we're always looking to talk with more people. So that is going to do it for tonight's stream, or today's stream. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where is in the art and science of games. Until next time, have a great night.